And to talk about that, that species or that community that lives over there that we are observing their practices, but we don't know anything about and we don't have a connection to. But that's not what we want to do. We want to remember that there are people of multiple generations represented in this room, and that we are called to be the body of Christ. So as we talk about each other, I, for one, am just going to ask forgiveness because I know that sometimes I fall into that pattern, but it's just kind of human nature, but we want to try to prevent ourselves from doing that while we're talking. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but in general, these are the generations that are represented in a typical congregation or neighborhood or community group. Now, there's fewer and fewer people 94 and older, so there's not quite as many there. And also, I might mention too that that at the end we will give you our email address. So if you would like these slides, we can email them to you. But you're welcome to take pictures of them as well. But we can get you the real thing. The two generations that we are going to talk about for this time are Millennials and Gen Z. You will read multiple studies that will have the age or the breakdown of their birth age and how long that generation spans. This is not a science. Frequently, it's determined by how long, what is typically a generation. In America, it's usually 18 to 20 years old. It's a time when young people start to come of age. And typically in America, when we are talking about generations, which most of these categories are, not all, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the breakdown is often around a war that happened within our history and kind of how that impacted the coming of age or how that impacted that generation. So we are going to go a little deeper, dig a little deeper with two generations, millennials. Until Gen Z, which we expect will outpace millennials, millennials are the largest generation in our country right now. They are over 79 million. It's a little over, I think it's like 27% of our population. So we're not talking about a fringe group over there. We're talking about a 1 in 4 people in our country. This is a generation of innocence lost fairly quickly. My son was in preschool, 5 years old, when we saw the World Trade Towers coming down. It's a generation that has lived through 2 recessions. So they never came of age without knowing that tragedy can happen on their continent, and even within their families and communities with job losses and economic downturns. They graduated from high school or left high school knowing that the economy would probably be somewhat difficult and that there were threats out there that other generations did not know as decisively as their generation did. They're what we call mobile pioneers, so they will remember when they got their first smartphone, and probably most people in this room remember when they got their first smartphone, whereas, or probably remember when their family got a first smartphone, whereas my 15-year-old daughter doesn't remember a time when there was not some kind of device in our household, because she's always grown up with that, in the hands of somebody in our family. It is more diverse than any other generation, and I'm referring mostly to, sometimes I'll say North America, sometimes I'll say America, and that's because much of the research has come out of North America. That doesn't mean that all of it has, but it does vary somewhat continent to continent, although there are some, because we are more and more a global economy and a global world, some of these things pertain to other cultures and other continents, but most of the research that I will refer to comes from North America, so that's what I can speak of most confidently. 32% live at home. So these are 20 to 40-year-olds, give or take, which is more than any other, not any other generation in history, but certainly any other recent generation. More millennials live with a parent than a spouse. They're getting married later and later, so whereas the generation before them, a much higher percentage would live with a spouse by the time they are 20 to 40 years old. This is also a generation that benefited from the No Child Left Behind education policies. So when I was a kid, if you got an A on a test, you got an A. If you got a D, you got a D, and you moved on to the next chapter. That was it. The sense of the approach that the school would be responsible for making sure that you learned it, and that you had a chance to prove that you were competent in that chapter before you personally moved on, is a much more student-centered education approach as opposed to a curriculum-driven approach, which makes a difference. So this generation was the first generation to have completed 12 years with that. Gen Z was born typically 2000 to 2020, so we are already talking about people confidently that have not even been born yet. So that's, in some ways, we need to be humble when we talk about this, because there's a lot of things that we don't even know, but we're observing habits of this generation, or observing differences than what we've seen in previous generations. I don't know if you can see this comic, but this dad is sitting there reading the paper, which doesn't happen that much anymore. And this little girl says, he says, "Hey, sweetie, how was school today?" And she says, "You can read all about it on my blog, Dad." So this is a generation that is much more savvy with internet resources and apps and all kinds of things on the computer that like I was saying to Noel before this, in high school I had took a typing class. Well, nobody does that anymore. There's not even such thing as that. But that was something that our school thought would be, we had driver's ed and typing just so that you could navigate the world.
You're sold.
Right now, Gen Z is 26% of the population, so we are assuming that they will continue to outpace their older millennial friends. Their online lives are spontaneous. My daughter, if I'm driving her to a friend's house, probably 20 to 30 Snapchat messages are sent within 10 minutes. I don't know, maybe more. But she's constantly sharing what she's doing, even if it's just like just a snap of just a face of her. She's constantly sharing that, and yet it's highly curated. So she looks at the picture, delete, get a better picture, get a better picture. It's highly curated what she posts, although it's frequently, it doesn't have to be an event or a family reunion. It's like, I got in the car with my mom. Hey, Mom, let's take a picture. So this is a post-Columbine generation. They've lived for 20 years knowing that things like Columbine can happen, and things like nothing has changed in their environment in their country to stop something like that from happening. And I hear that in the classroom. That's very much a part of their awareness. There's some helplessness and frustration with adults around them, which is different than how I grew up, that adults can help and change. They're not seeing that in some areas. They're very pragmatic, and they are multi-ethnic, but also the most biracial population we've ever seen in America. And I think we're talking about America for the most part. Oh.
So I thought it would be helpful also as we begin with those definitions of the Millennial and Gen Z generations to also set a vision for what it means to then talk about those generations in worship. And so forgive me if this is sort of a review for some of you, but I want to review two core values that we're assuming in our presentation about worship with millennials and Gen Z generations. So the first core value is that worship should be intergenerational. And the second core value to frame our discussion later about what this means is that worship is viewed as formative. And you can find all of the 10 core convictions about worship on our website. It's also, for those of you who are at the Grants Colloquium, it's printed in your Grants program. And you can see this theme throughout our work here on our website. So just briefly, intergenerational worship, what we're talking about is having all ages included in the worshiping community. And so we're not trying to talk about casting a vision for creating separate services for these generations. And so this means also that we're not necessarily trying to create this idea of these generations and their characteristics as being some sort of a target market, and then we're trying to meet their preferences and that kind of thing. And what we are talking about is still a readiness to adapt on the part of older generations who may hold more power in these communities, a readiness to adapt as we observe certain characteristics that are emerging in these younger generations. So here's an analogy. Imagine that every summer you had a tradition with your family of going on vacation and renting a beach house together. I think this beach house is way beyond my family's budget, but I put it up there as a reference, all right? So let's say that it's 3 adult children and their spouses, and then the parents who are retirement age, and you're renting this beach house together. What's your schedule and your vacation going to look like? You might have waking up late in the morning. You're going on long leisurely strolls on the beach. You can fall asleep in the afternoon while reading a book out on the deck. You can enjoy your happy hour. You can be flexible with your meals. What happens, though, when the next year you add these lovely twins? These are my twins when they were 8 months old. So what happens when you add them into the mix? So how are things going to change? All of a sudden, gone is the sleeping in, gone is the relaxed schedule for meals and that kind of thing. And so this is kind of the idea that we're talking about when we talk about intergenerational worship. You're not creating necessarily something specially just for them, but you are acknowledging that these new people are here bringing their different perspectives, needs, stages to our community, and they're part of our community, and so our community needs to think about how to adapt and include. The other core value is that worship is seen as formative. What it means to talk about worship as formative is that worship is not simply expressive of what we already think, what we already feel, what we already believe, but it also, on the flip side, it helps to form what we think, feel, and believe. So how a congregation prays both reveals what they believe about God and also forms worshipers' understanding of who God is, how God is active in the world. Think about if you are a congregation that only typically, or maybe even not exclusively, but very much focuses on the health needs of elderly citizens of your congregation, what that communicates as far as who God is, how God is active, and what kinds of values your community as a whole holds in common. So another way to say that is that worship shapes our spiritual habits. And I want to also emphasize that there's a focus here then. We want to convey a focus not just on language and cognition, not just beliefs about God, but also a model of spirituality. How do we live out our faith together? All these things are assumed in what it means for worship to be formative. So here's an analogy. Here's my kids again. This is really just an excuse to show pictures of my kids. That's what I'm doing up here. So as you can see, we've added a third one in here. This was a couple of years ago. They're 7, 7, and 6 now. The other day, somehow, I can't remember how, but we got into a discussion about bad words. And one of my children, my son, on the right there, he informed me that he knew 3 bad words. And of course, my ears kind of perked up as a father, and I said, now, tell me about this. And I found out I was able to get out of them what the words were, and to my relief, they weren't the worst words. So, and it was actually a good moment for me to hear what he considered to be bad words, and I was glad that he considered them, because that's what we have taught him. But you maybe can already see where this is going. My next question, though, is now where did you learn these bad words? What did he tell me? From me. Yeah. Of course, Dad, we learned them from you. And this, for me, was a reminder of not only did they learn the English language from me, they learned words and how to use words in situations. There's a whole language, a formative environment that I have created. I inevitably create that, being their parent. There is no two ways about it. And so that's an analogy of how worship works in a formative direction. So Tom Long talks about this in his book Testimony, where worship is God's language school. We learn how to relate to God. We learn truthful and grace-filled speech. We learn vertical habits, what it means to relate to God through the things that are modeled for us, not just linguistically, but also a model of spirituality and living out our faith together in community. So here's one more example. This is Nate and Carolyn, and they are leading us in worship at last year's event at this same time of the year. Nate and Carolyn are leading us in gospel music. And this is a way of worshiping that involves much more dance, much more movement, much more celebration than I typically, as a white mainline person, have typically experienced in worship services. Now, if I were to look at this through a purely expressive lens, I would get caught up with questions such as, now, how do you get to that point where you're able to celebrate in worship every week? How do I feel it every week? But looking at that same practice from a formative lens, I would say, now, it's not necessarily about having to always feel it to be able to express it to God. It's when I am a child growing up in a church that practices celebration, and I know the stories of those adults, and I see them dancing in the joy of the Lord week in and week out, even when things are bad, that to me conveys a very important message about what joy is. Joy is not just for when I'm feeling it and I want to express it to God. Joy also forms me in the good times and the bad, and it reminds me that celebration and the joy of the Lord is not dependent upon my circumstances. So you see what we're talking about when we talk about intergenerational worship and formative worship. Your turn.
Tag on Mitt. We did not hear John Whitfleet's words this morning, so we did frame this in the language of the Ten Commandments. But, that's how we frame our lives, right?
Consider them Proverbs. I mean, we could easily rephrase them to be
Beatitudes,
Proverbs.
You could say blessed is, but we also thought there's a heft to these words that maybe a command is in order. So we are going to, I'm going to walk through these fairly quickly, and Noel, if there's something that you want to add in, please do. And you should have them in front of you, so hopefully we will clarify. So we're going to begin with millennials. And number one, thou shalt not refer to anyone over 18 as kids unless they are your biological children. Is this, okay, this is praise the Lord?
Amen.
Okay, okay, so we're getting so that's kind of a basic starter as you talked about, when the family vacation where we're making room for each other, we're not saying, okay, we're going to get you another house on the compound. We are going to include you in this, but we need to know how to talk to each other, and we need to know how to affirm each other's presence. So that would be a good starting place. Some of these are in order of importance, but some of these are just a list that we created. So thou shalt not, or blessed is the congregation that does not change worship for the sake of millennials. Again, this kind of refers back to what Noel was saying about the target, feeling like you're a target. There's not a bullseye on the back of their jacket, but it is, there is a sense that we're making room for you here, but we are not changing to do what we think millennials want to, that it's not a millennial fashioned service. Does that make sense? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thou shalt not design programs for millennials without talking to millennials. Seems kind of basic, but we thought it needed to be said because a lot of times churches think, well, if we build it, they will come, but they don't always think about including millennials in the circle. One, because they may not know some, but they also may not know, they may not really want to hear what they want to say. So it's important to include millennials in the circle. Thou shalt not ask the youth director to design programs for millennials. Youth ministry and ministry to millennials, one, they're about 20 years apart in focus, but it's a very different skill set. Now, that's not to say that a youth pastor could not do this, but it is not the same skill set. It's not necessarily a continuum of what the youth pastor is doing.
Yeah, and I'm probably part of the rationale that we're emphasizing here is that oftentimes that's a way for the community to then sort of get itself off the hook. Say, yeah, we've got that over there, and the youth director's on that, so the rest of us don't have to necessarily consider that ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And the youth director possibly is a millennial, but that still doesn't mean that it's a continuum of that ministry. Thou shalt not treat millennials as alien species. What I mean by this, probably does require some explanation. There's a whole industry, and certainly publishing industry, on creating the millennial as so distinctly other that they somehow cannot be integrated into what we do. As a community, as a corporation, as a church, as anything. Millennials still date, they still need to find jobs, they still have to find places to live, they still have parents, they still have children, they still do a lot of the basic things that any generation has done since Adam and Eve. There are a few things, they look a little different than you might have when you were their age, but think about you as a 25-year-old. You look different than you do now too. So, and you may not be proud of that look when you show other people how you looked at 25. So we're all impacted by the culture, and so they look different for sure because you looked different at 25 as well. Thou shalt not create a 3-year timeline to establish a ministry. This idea comes from a book that I'll talk about in a few minutes with Mark DeVries and Steve Pontier. I think Steve Pontier is his name. they recommend, and I've seen in other literature, that 5 years should be a minimum of a commitment to some kind of program like this. And some of that is because the church has loosened a focus or loosened the reins on thinking about ministry with millennials. And so there's some catch-up time to do, but it's also like when you have children, I'm going back to the vacation analogy, it just takes a while to get into the rhythm of, if you were the first person in your family to bring kids into the family, there's still people going out for happy hour and going out late at night, and nobody wants to be quiet and when they come in at night, or they want to sleep in. It takes a while for a system to adjust to that. So the recommendation is that you shouldn't say, well, we hired somebody for 1 year to focus on young adults, and we only got 5 or 4 or whatever. And I've heard that several times. But really to see this as a long-term commitment.
And would you see that also as a necessary step to avoid a perpetuation of a feeling of abandonment? Also, does that have anything to do with it in this commandment?
Yeah.
So having a 5-year commitment. It seems to me that what we're talking about, in addition to all the adjustments and the long-term view, that this is also just a healthy practice in general so it doesn't feel like it's a program that's designed to sort of, again, just hit that market target, but it's actually, you're not perpetuating a feeling of abandonment on the part of young people by older generations.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and it's it's just I think things take longer in the church to change, but I think in particular this generation is maybe doesn't have to be on the same timeline that other generations had to have been. So they're accustomed to having things happen a little slower. But I think that as an institution, 5 years is a good.
Yeah, thanks.
Thou shalt not assume a millennial ministry will be financially stable in 5 years. Scott Pontier is the name that I was thinking of. Scott Pontier and Mark DeVries talk a lot about this in a book that I will talk about in a few minutes. Not only is a 3-year plan, which is somewhat typical for churches to put forward, not necessarily a good idea, but financial stability may not happen for a long time. It may not happen. So this is another argument for intergenerational ministry, because nesting ministries in other, within the whole of the church is a commitment to the different generations. But the sign of financial sustainability will probably not be a mark of success. Thou shalt not wait for millennials to be ready to serve. And this is kind of where our hashtag came from. We're so proud of that. Hashtag what can I do? Because the sense of being ready to serve is an older person's perspective on what does ready mean, when does ready happen, and it's pretty subjective, but it's also not necessary, and it's kind of antithetical to being the body of Christ and certainly being a worshiping community. And so, millennials don't want to hear that they need to be on 2 committees before they can serve on session, or that they need to do these certain things before they are considered ready to serve in some way. They often come prepared. Now, if you say, well, if you're here for 5 years, then you can sing in the worship band or whatever. 5 years might as well be 100 years, because they have no idea where they're going to be. And frankly, you don't either, but they're more realistic about that. So now is now, and what can I do now? And it's something to be taken seriously. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to be responsible and say, okay, do you want to be the treasurer of the church? It just means that what is a way that they can meaningfully be engaged? That's important. It's important to them in their faith formation. Thou shalt not be critical of their culture. As I said before, if you think of yourself at 25 or, there's, I just have up here, remember Frank Sinatra or Mick Jagger, or we were talking about Elvis Presley. There's people that, if you look back on the culture when you came of age, there are cultural icons that could be easily criticized, and it's not as if your coming of age process was any purer or holier than somebody else's. And this is a culture that is, it's not really fair game to critique. And number 10, thou shalt not assume all is well. Millennials have more college debt than you do, and since 1980, college education has increased 268%. And I believe the cost of living has increased 120. So they have financial burdens that you did not have. Salaries are much more stagnant. Healthcare, when I graduated from college in 1985, I don't think there was a job without healthcare benefits. I mean, that was just given. Now it's not in any way assured, and it's considered luxury is probably too strong of a word, but it's not a given that you will have healthcare with a full-time job. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for this generation. So, I think millennials are known for being enjoyable people, looking for opportunities to enjoy life, whether it's the moment, the conversation, the meal, the worship experience. But that does not mean that all is well or that they have it, that everything is fine in their life. They are facing a lot of challenges, but there's a choice that they make to see life and enjoy life from a certain perspective. So this is really important to keep in mind in the background. That's 10. My instinct is to say any questions, but I'm not going to.
All right,
I'm
push
going,
through.
keep going. Okay, worshiping with Gen Z. Thou shalt not refer to someone under 20 years old as a millennial. The millennial has become this description of anybody younger than you. Young, right? So millennials, Gen Z, they're somebody under 20 is different. They see the world differently. They interact with the world differently. They would like to be treated differently, and so they are not to be confused. Thou shalt not assume screens will lure young people to worship. That's or to youth group or to a teen club or anything else like that. Screens are a vehicle for communication and for navigating the world that they live in, but they are not, they're not moths. They don't just, it's a screen. Oh, what is a screen? Oh, like some church, if you put up screen, like a TV screen, or if you, like all of a sudden now airports, there's iPads everywhere. Like, you don't talk to a person, you order on iPad, which is kind of cool, but but I don't know. I don't know that was a desire of people. I think that's probably another business model. But to have a TV screen or have iPads everywhere, or to walk into McDonald's and have to order your coffee on an iPad, that is not because young people say, I don't want to talk to somebody, I better have a screen. That is not the instigator of that. Young people know how to navigate the world of screens better than, or quicker and better sometimes than other people, but it's not that they cannot talk to people or cannot be a part of a space without a screen. Sometimes they actually welcome, young people are better at putting their phones away this is a study of like during vacation and like for a movie, or they're able to compartmentalize times of their life easier than their parents. Thou shalt not protect young people by avoiding difficult topics from the pulpit. Because of living with screens for much of their life, because of the world that is around them that is interpreted, and because news flies so much faster, and when I was younger, my parents could protect me because I didn't stay up to watch the 11 o'clock news. And that's when they found out what was happening in the world. They see it all, so it's really important for faith to be able to talk about what is happening on the border of our country right now, or what is happening anywhere in the world, because they already know it. So how can we talk about how our faith is equipping us to talk about these issues, or to advocate or stand up for people that need to hear the gospel? If we don't talk about it, they are automatically assuming that we don't have anything to say to address these issues. Thou shall not assume there are any common cultural references. This is a tough one, because you can't say, everybody saw Incredibles this weekend, right? Or everybody knows the new Beyonce and Jay-Z song, right? Wrong. Some people do, but you can't say, there's not 3 major television networks. There's 300 channels, and, thousands of movies and shows that are put out by different, Netflix, Amazon, iTunes. There's so many places. I teach a class, on young adults in the church, and I'll say, write on the board every show that you've watched in the last week, and very little overlap. Thou shalt not overlook diversity. This generation lives with much more diversity than previous generations. They not only are comfortable with it, they expect it, and they are diverse. So they live with it. It's not something that you say, well, maybe we could get a speaker to come in or something, because in the rest of their life, they are living in a much more integrated world. Now, there are churches that we talked about that, your neighborhood is this, so what can you do? Making efforts to create partnerships or to create relationships with other places, but acknowledging that there needs to be diversity in our understanding of who we are as Christian people, and how we stand together as people of faith in a world that has a lot of challenges. If your congregation is not diverse, you need to find places where you can create diversity in relationships. Thou shalt not assume community will be experienced Sunday at 11 a.m. My grandparents went to church at 11 o'clock at the church on the corner of Quick and Bonnie Bray Street in River Forest, Illinois, and they knew that when they walked in, people would know them, that they would feel like, these are my people. And a lot of times, younger people are looking for community in different places. It's not at a time and a place. It's usually, this isn't my phone, but pretend it is, often experience, or community is often experienced in absence. So presence, a community presence, is often experienced when you're absent from each other, because you might be texting, you might be all looking at something at the same time, snapping. But community, but you can all be together in presence of each other and not experience community. And so it doesn't just happen because you walk into a time and place. Things need to occur, relationships need to be prompted. in order for that community to occur, or a sense of community to occur. Do not assume young people no longer care about faith. There is a lot of literature on nuns being, checking that they don't have a faith. That's, there's certainly some of that. An article came out last week on, I think the Gay Lesbian Alliance, that they were shocked with the high level of spirituality that people of other communities were talking about, and that surprised them because there was an assumption that because they were not in the church or living a life that they thought was traditional to that church's values, that they must not have faith. And I think many young people are finding opportunities to explore their faith and grow as spiritual people outside of the traditional church because they can't see where they might find a place in that community. And so because they are not there with you does not mean that they do not have a faith or are not interested in growing. Thou shalt not assume science has no place. That's a double negative. We should have caught that.
No, that still works, though.
Has no place in the exploration of faith. This has come up quite a bit, and it surprised me personally because it has not been a part of my faith trajectory. But in a lot of the research, the fact that churches are not addressing issues of science is a huge loss, because these are questions that young people have. They're expecting a dialogue. They do not want to be told there is a conflict. And the fact that one side of the argument or one side of the conversation is completely missing is troubling for young people, and is certainly a challenge in faith for them that the church is not addressing in any way science. If any of you are familiar with the Barna study that just came out in Gen Z, that was one of the major findings. And they said, most youth pastors and preachers are not trained to preach about science or to even have conversations with faith and science interactions. And it's a huge loss and a desire for this generation. Thou shalt not assume there is only one way to listen. So I loved when Barbara Newman this morning pulled out her apron and the things to shake and the sign language. And this is a very visual generation. We all are, as a culture, I think, much more visual than we were 50 years ago. But stained glass windows were designed for a reason. I mean, people still need to learn in ways that are not just oral learning. It's really important to think more holistically about all the senses as we are creating worship experiences. Thou shalt not assume a young person wants to grow up and be like you. I don't know if there ever was the ladder, so to speak, the corporate ladder, but there is a sense of, you'll be groomed to become the person that's just above you, and that you will want to do that. That's not necessarily the trajectory of this generation. They are more comfortable they like you. It's cool that you're you. You be you. And I'll do me. And it's like, that's okay. Like, that's fine. They're not threatened by you. They're glad you do you because they need you to do what you do here, but they don't need to be you.
So we have done a lot of telling you what not to do. So I figured it might be helpful to at least have some suggestions. So these are a couple of things that I'm reflecting on out of my experience, and especially I'm honing in on the things that I personally as a pastor was slow to learn, and only picked these things up sort of by trial and error and failure. So you can infer some of the suggestions that we might have for you by what we told you in the commandments, thou shalt not. So, but really this was an important lesson for me to learn of having no assumptions of common knowledge, including biblical references. There maybe was a day when a preacher could sort of reference an Old Testament story like David and Goliath and just assume that everybody just instantly, the light bulb goes on and ding and we all get it. There needs to be intentionality now on the part of leaders in worship, both with the worship practices of one's church and with the things that we say or do in preaching and in prayer, to think more intentionally about retracing our steps. How did I, as a person, learn this, if you're a leader or a worship leader or a pastor? And how can I then go back to the beginning and assume no common knowledge and in a succinct, winsome way sort of catch us all up to speed? This is something that can be awful hard to do sometimes, how to retrace your steps to see where you got to where you are now in your own knowledge. One story that comes to mind is when I was a chaplain and I was invited to speak in a class, and I was talking about the issue of sexuality, and I was talking from a pastoral perspective, and somebody had asked me a question about what biblical references I might reference to talk about this topic. And among the other things I said, well, and then there's the Song of Solomon. And I got zero recognition. I was like, y'all don't know about this whole book of the Bible that's Hebrew love poetry? You have no. Okay, so I had to sort of go back and start and explain that this was actually a thing. So one way to also think about this is look for how you can frame things, how you can think always in terms of this is just a good practice anyways, but how can you frame what the church does in worship and in preaching and in scripture in such a way as to a newcomer that could understand. And so this is an example from Kevin Adams, who is a pastor in Lincoln, California. He planted a church with an intentionality for being in a post-Christian environment. So this is an example of a framing phrase that he has used right before giving a final blessing. So instead of just standing up and pronouncing the benediction, the blessing, he prefaces it with these words: "Our world is thirsty for people of good news. You've received good news. You've been called and equipped to embody it. Would you receive a blessing so we can be people of good news in a world desperate for grace?" So, and then that provides the frame from which to understand then the worship practice. What I love about that is that also that segues into this next suggestion that I have, is that also shows a bias and a direction towards concrete action. This is, again, the hashtag, what can I do? This is the title. Because of all the things that we learn how to do in worship, such as praise God, ask God for help, intercede, the question, what can I do, is a huge question in working with some of these younger generations. In my experience, this was something that was very difficult for me to learn. I'm an academic, and I spent a lot of time in my head, and so my normal practice, and this is pretty consistent in Western education, right? You get the theory right first, and then you put it into practice, right? So think about when you're in your normal practice as a ministry, as a worship community, how you can flip that on your head and flip that model on its head and actually start with practice, start by doing. Younger generations don't want or necessarily necessarily need to have it all figured out before they put it into practice. It actually can work the other way. You can learn by doing, then reflect. So then pay attention, also pay close attention, as Lynn has said, about what young people have to offer and getting them involved. Again, not just waiting until they've paid their dues in some meaningless task, but what gifts can they actually bring to the community that they can be put to use in. Not, again, all by themselves in some sort of role that's inappropriate, but with an appropriate mentoring and structure, but real meaningful work and service and leadership that they can do in your church. Don't hesitate to get them involved when you pay close attention to the gifts that they bring. So here are some of the resources that we have mentioned that we've been drawing upon. Do you want to say any more about these?
Yeah, Beyond the Screen by Andrew Zersky is, I think, one of the greatest books ever. I've read it several times. It talks about youth ministry for connected but alone generation, but I think in a lot of ways it just talks about our culture. And it's the truths that it focuses on youth ministry, I think, translate beautifully to all of us who are more and more connected by our screens, but often alone, but also because we use screens to communicate, how can we use that in ministry? Or how can we use, like he has his, just a small thing, they have to send an emoji to everybody in their youth group once a week, just to say, like, this is how I'm feeling, this is how I'm going. And so that's not in any way an example of the book, but like just ways in which we have screens in our lives. They're how we communicate, it's how we navigate our world, how we create community. So how can we use that within ministry and not be threatened by it, or not leave our cell phones in a basket at the door, but really use them as integrated into the ministry. Reimagining Young Adult Ministry is a guidebook for the ordinary church, and many of the ideas that we talked about here are gleaned from Scott Pontier and Mark DeVries' book, and it's kind of a lot of, don't do this, here's what we've done, here's some things that work, but here's a good process to figure out what will work in your church.
And contrary to the way that we did it, they actually have an equal number of don't do this and actually do this.
If you were here 2 hours, we could have done.
Yeah. And I mentioned before, or maybe I didn't mention, but I meant to mention the Church of All Ages, Generations Worshiping Together is a book about intergenerational worship. And
this book, Intergenerate, is hot off the press yesterday. It came out. I have a chapter in it, yes. And it's on intergenerational ministry, transforming churches through intergenerational ministry. And lots of church practitioners talking about values and just good best practices on implementing intergenerational ministry and why it's good for the church.
There's our email addresses if you would like to contact us and you don't have a time to find us after this, if you have some more questions or things that you want to discuss. And we probably have a time for maybe a couple of questions if there's anybody that wants to reflect or have a question for us as presenters.
Someone mentioned that we can get the oil.
Yep. Yes.
In my context, we have a pretty diverse community of Americans and migrant, Gen Z, millennials. Is any of this research kind of including that population, or is it strictly, American students?
A lot of the research is North American based. However, because in particular millennials and Gen Z are much more global in many of the things that have shaped their generation are global, and they just their world comes to them through the internet, which is so it's just so yes and no is my because they wherever you are on this planet, you may see the same song or the same reference or the same hashtag or whatever. The viral things are going in different places, but the context probably does shape some of that. However, this generation is much more accustomed to diversity. So I would say yes and no, if that helps. But yeah, you'll have to tell me. Yeah. But it's not just exclusive. And that's just happening at an exponentially growing pace. That the world is shrinking for a lot of people on certain topics.
I just have a comment. I recently visited a church in Tampa, Florida, that had a very active intergenerational ministry, and they mirrored the mentors, adult mentors, worked with both millennials and Gen Z, and so much so that the younger students were actually, there's a team of them in every ministry of the church, particularly the audio-visual and IT, because they would even operate the sound systems and all of the lights and all that for most of the services. And so that at any time there's a backup team, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah, you're raising an issue that Noel talked a little bit about. If you say you get a young person, don't put them all on the booth or the stage, or say, okay, our worship band is made up of all Gen Z. Isn't that great? We're an intergenerational church. That's not helpful, because they don't know if that maybe, I was going to say Led Zeppelin, but there's Stairway to Heaven, but that they wouldn't play Stairway to Heaven. Although my 14-year-old does have Stairway to Heaven. It's like, hey, is that my album? It's not, though, but she bought it. But that's not intergenerational, that's not shaping, that's not having somebody kind of aligned with you or mentoring. Back to your question, there are some ways in which the segregation of generations is more North American than in other cultures. Some cultures have not allowed that to break down as quickly and as decidedly as we have.
I know that you began with two core values, one being that it's intergenerational, but what about the context where, like I work in a high school, we have chapels, it's not intergenerational, it's for this group of students on a university campus or in a youth ministry. How can that worship gathering be formative still when it's limiting, right? Because we want it to be formative, we want to be able to empower, but constantly battling a tension of, well, this is ours versus you're making me use, so I don't want to participate. And probably a bigger question than right now, but.
Well, I like that question. It's a really complicated issue, though, and I would still personally say that I would want to see the same principles and thinking lie behind. It just may get worked out differently in those contexts. So, it may be that the worship band in some of those contexts is more purely of that one generation, and yet still there's opportunities there to not just hand everything over and just say, go to it, but there's opportunities there for adults to be mentoring, standing alongside, and hoping that some of the things that they're doing while they're mentoring and standing alongside, that even those things themselves are at least helping to shape and to form the people that they're working with on a worship team, if not in the larger congregation of those young people. And I would also say, that We were talking about this a lot because we have college chaplains and people from other those institutional settings here, but this is still a huge question also of how do you actually get those generations worshiping together when it comes to professors and students, and if you're locked into that target market kind of thinking, then you're sort of oftentimes stuck with one or the other. And so, it's a tough question. I would hope that those same ideas and principles could still inform the work that's done. One last question.
I understood the core value of intergenerational. Do you find that congregations are moving away from or not employing the dual services, the youth service during the same time as another service going on in the congregation?
Do you know any data on that? My bias has been, in my experience, to see that as more of a thing that was kind of tried in certain churches in the earlier, couple decades ago, and seeing a certain wisdom that arose out of some of those trials and errors, and wanting to emphasize a bias back toward not separating the generations out. But as far as the data is concerned, I have no idea if there is any data on how many churches would be doing that.
I don't know the data, but I know that it's very hard to pull back together when churches try to do that, and you're less than whole, because I think you need each other, and you need the vitality that each it becomes two different congregations, basically. So I don't know, but I know that it always seems like a new great idea. Let's get something different for them, and so that idea keeps popping up. But it's probably easier to plan another separate service. It's just easier to do that than to figure out ways to create space in the, in the household of God for all the generations there. It's hard. It's not easy.
Thank you so much for coming and for engaging. And here's again our emails if you need to follow up or want to follow up. But most of you have another workshop to get to, so you are dismissed.